told us around 9. But you do this every morning. Okay. We're going to get a little bit today and then we can get tomorrow.
In September of 1985, Samora Michel, the president of Mozambique, visited Atlanta and Mayor Andrew Young. Michel was on a 5-day political and trade mission that included a meeting with President Reagan. He was accompanied by his wife and an entourage of 45 Mozambicans. Mayor Young first met President Michel in Mozambique in 1977, when he was serving as the United States Ambassador to the United Nations. Born in 1933, Michel had been a major figure in Southern Africa since the 1960s, when he was the leader of Frelimo, the organization that fought against the Portuguese colonialists, and then assumed power when the Portuguese left Mozambique in 1974. An outspoken opponent of apartheid, Michel was quoted as saying, "In our region, there is still only one force that opposes the materialization of Martin Luther King's dream, the regime of apartheid. In the struggle against apartheid, we are continuing the spirit and example set by Martin Luther King, and we shall win." Samora Michel was killed when his presidential jetliner crashed into a plateau near Komatipoort in South Africa. Although unproven, the survivors of the accident stated that their plane had been shot. Michel was buried at Hero Square in the capital city of Maputo in Mozambique on October 28, 1986. On October 31, 1986, Mayor Young joined other Michel supporters at a memorial service for Samora Michel at the Interdenominational Theological Center here in Atlanta.
Brothers and sisters, I've come to be drawn much closer to my faith as I live longer and as I see crucifixion after crucifixion end in resurrection after resurrection. And so it's almost with a sense of celebration that we come together. For we know that God has called home by perhaps an evil hand a good brother, a man that it was impossible not to love. This was a man who was so exuberant, so joyful, so filled with the Spirit of God in his own life that even Ronald Reagan had to love him. And one of the things that's quite ironic, but also one of those kinds of things through which the Spirit of God continues to move, is that the daughter of President Reagan was in attendance paying tribute to the life of Samora Michel in Mozambique on Tuesday. I first knew of Frelimo maybe before there was a Frelimo. And Samora Michel, really strong and wonderful individual though he was really also an expression of a strong and wonderful and glorious people. But I was with Eduardo Mondlane at a church conference in Indiana in 1951. We were the only two black folk there. And we spent our time talking about what we wanted to do with our lives. This was 3 years after the independence of India, and we were both reading Gandhi. And we were both wondering whether the teachings of Gandhi would have any relevance to the United States or to Africa. The first demonstrations organized by Eduardo Mondlane were fired upon by the Portuguese soldiers, and some 30 of their number were killed in a peaceful demonstration. And so it almost wiped out the possibility of a nonviolent approach to their liberation from the very beginning. But they never lost sight of the basic humanism which was the real reason why they were determined to be free. In my first visit to Mozambique, sitting around one evening with Samora and some of his lieutenants, they began to reminisce about how they first got into battle. And most of them were students. And they decided in school that they had to leave school and that they had to go out into the bush and join Eduardo Mondlane and others. But they had no weapons. So they decided to sneak upon a Portuguese garrison and see if they could not steal weapons in the middle of the night and then go join their older brothers. In sneaking into the arsenal, they found their weapons, but none of them had ever used weapons very much before. But they were discovered, and Portuguese soldiers descended on them, and a bitter fight ensued. Somehow, miraculously, they won that fight. And none of them were killed, but several of them were wounded, as were some of the Portuguese wounded. And they described how they gathered the wounded together and then sat around and cried, for they had never killed before. And they didn't know what it would mean now that they had embarked upon this journey. Samora being a nurse and others among them trained in healthcare, they immediately decided that they had to give first aid to the living. And they made a very interesting decision which went throughout Frelimo and continues in Mozambique. When they pulled together the wounded and began to treat them, they not only treated their colleagues who were black, but they also treated the Portuguese soldiers. And when Portuguese soldiers were losing blood and needed blood, they gave the Portuguese soldiers their own blood. And they carried the Portuguese soldiers with them, though wounded, with their own wounded, because they could not leave a human being there to die. And when they discovered that the Portuguese soldiers couldn't read and write, they set up schools to teach them. And many of the Portuguese soldiers who were captured by Frelimo in their liberation struggle refused to go back to Portugal and remain today as part and parcel of the government of the People's Republic of Mozambique. I tell this story because it represents the faith, the humanity, and the vision of one people coming together in spite of a colonial heritage, in spite of violence and in spite of bloodshed. Somehow, perhaps out of his Presbyterian home, Samora Michel and Eduardo Mondlane always had a kind of concept of forgiveness in the midst of their revolution. When they became independent, they did not kill the collaborators with the Portuguese. They retrained them. And Samora Michel is reported to have stood up after people were crying out for vengeance against the Portuguese who were there and the collaborators who had betrayed them, and giving one of the most dynamic and charismatic speeches of his career in behalf of forgiveness and mercy for those who had been their oppressors and those who had been their betrayers. And so, in spite of the fact that there was every reason to hate, every reason to live by the sword, there nevertheless has always been a sense of compassion, a sense of forgiveness, and a profound sense of Christian humanism that has undergirded the life and faith of the movement of Frelimo and the people of Mozambique. As I began to know them better, and as I began to try to establish a relationship with the Patriotic Front, the Patriotic Front was rightly suspicious. Robert Mugabe had been betrayed over and over again, and every time he sought to move to reconcile his differences with the unilateral declaration of independence and the Rhodesian Front, every time he sought to reach out to work with the British, he was betrayed. Every time he looked to the Russians even for help, he was betrayed. And so when I went to Mozambique, Robert Mugabe was a man that was wary of every overture and saw in it the continued attempted betrayal which had characterized the 10 years that he had been in the midst of that struggle. And yet it was Samora Michel that sat us down together and said, look, the only reason we're fighting is for the right to sit down and work out a constitution. The only reason we struggle is for the opportunity to achieve peace. Peace with people regardless of race, creed, or color. And he said, Robert, I hope you will take advantage of this peace process. Even if you don't stop fighting, never miss an opportunity to sit down and see if you can't, around the table, work out an agreement that might bring fighting to an end. Africa has suffered too long. Too many of us have died. We've got to find a way to end the killing. And I think that was the thing that drove Michel even to the point of trying to reach an agreement with the South Africans at Nkamati. He was not a naive man. He knew exactly who Botha was. But he was a man who hoped against hope, who always felt that if there was any possibility for peace, it was worth the risk of his life or the risk of his political career and future. He was an extraordinary man. When he visited us here in Atlanta, even though he was here for a very little time, I think the infectiousness of his personality captured everybody that he met. And one of the things that I'll never forget is that as busy and harassed as this man's schedule has been, he insisted on our finding him a set of weights. And we moved some weights, and the hotel had a bicycle, stationary bike, that he moved up into his room because he was determined that all of the eating that he was doing, he was not going to go above his very trim and hardened 140-pound battle weight. And so at 5 o'clock in the morning, he was up riding that bicycle, that stationary bicycle, and lifting those weights and making the part of his physical fitness the very beginning of his day. He was a man of that kind of discipline and determination. And so was his wife, that kind of woman. I don't know a more beautiful people than the people of Mozambique. I don't know a more powerful people than the people of Mozambique. And they're characteristic of all of Southern Africa. And when I heard of Samora's death, I mourned his passing, and I felt at first that this was a dark day for Southern Africa. And then I remembered the day I stood behind Martin Luther King as he fell and died instantly from a shot of a bullet. And I thought then that that was the end of our movement. And yet our experience was, and has been, that Martin Luther King turned out to be far more powerful in death than he was in life. The experience of our practical experience is that all of the things that Martin said about opening the doors of educational institutions to minorities never happened in his lifetime. Somehow in his death, and look at it, there were only about 250,000 students in all of the colleges in America, black, at the time of Martin's death. 2 years after his death, there were almost 1 million. Somehow in his death, people began to understand what he was about in his life. And I don't know what the future may hold for Southern Africa, but I know who holds the future. And I know that it is in God's power to use the blood of martyrs as the seed of his kingdom. I know that there is no remission of sin without the shedding of innocent blood, and Samora Michel has shed innocent blood in behalf of Africa. And I look now for God to bring us a miracle. We're in the midst of the crucifixion. Yes, and yet we're a people who know there's an empty tomb. We're a people who understand that the spirit of Samora Michel can never be quenched, that it does move across the African continent, but not just amongst black folk. For I guarantee you that even in the heart of the hardest of the Afrikaners who ever knew Samora Michel, there's a rethinking and an understanding that they too have lost one of the few men of faith and reason that had the power to shift and change the course of history when they lost Samora Michel. And so maybe even they will find it possible to come to their senses. Who knows what Maureen Reagan will learn in Mozambique? And who knows, she's developed a capacity. She's one of the few of the children that disagrees with her father and yet remains close to him. Who knows what message the power of the people of Mozambique will bring back even to that White House in Washington. Oh yes, the Spirit of God is moving all over the land. And it somehow can get even into the hearts of the most miserable of sinners. I know that because it's filled me. And I know that because I see some of my fellow sinners out there too, who would not be here today but for a powerful and merciful God who somehow is capable of making a way out of no way. And so I say to you that this is the cause of celebration. This is somehow another moment of triumph. This is the reason of our faith. Oh, we would love, like Peter and like Judas, to see Christ as the revolutionary slaughtering Herod. And yet he comes not through the sword, but he comes by the Spirit with the descent of a dove. It's not with swords loud clashing nor roll of stirring drum, but through deeds of love and mercy that the heavenly kingdom comes. And so we mourn the passing of a good friend, but we celebrate his victory over life. And we look forward not only to his personal resurrection, but we look forward to the resurrection/liberation of Mozambique and Namibia and Azania. God has blessed us with the presence of a strong Son. We praise his holy name. Amen.
uphondo lwayo izwa imithandazo